You have spoken about NATO and how NATO has pledged to defend fossil fuel infrastructure. And you've also talked about Pakistan and India that drown in military escalations and lose out in the struggle against climate change. What would it take for climate change to be acknowledged as a supreme security threat so that global environmental measures can be included in the already established spending for military and security, both in the US and worldwide? Not suggesting to leave it to the army, but pragmatically, what are the chances of such a line of argument going through?
Well, your comment about leaving it to the army is unfortunately appropriate. They're the ones who are doing something about it. The military is concerned, the Pentagon in particular, is concerned about the security threat of global warming and is devoting resources to it. So the Newport Naval Base, one of the major naval bases, will probably be flooded in the not distant future. So the military is undertaking expenses to preserve the military base. And they are concerned, the military is concerned, in fact, running exercises out of fear that as global warming increases, leads to violence, disruption, possibly very severe conflicts, the military will be called in to respond to them. And they're working on measures. You can see films, if you look on the Pentagon website, which they show how the military will respond to urban mass disorders and uprisings, which will arise from the devastating effects of global warming. That's not what you're talking about, but it's what's being done. So how can we have a sane and humane response to the crisis? There are no magic keys. There are old answers. They're the only ones. We can repeat them. They work with time and effort. There's no way around them. First is to educate the population, to get the population to understand that we are facing a major crisis. That's quite a problem. Let's take the United States, which I know best and which is, as far as I know, studied in most detail and is the most important case, the richest, most powerful state in world history. What happens in the United States will largely determine what the outcome of this crisis will be. So there happens to be a Yale University carries out regular detailed studies of popular attitudes on climate change. Careful, reliable studies. The most recent was released about a week ago. The design of the study was to present Americans with 29 choices of urgent issues and ask people, how do you rank them for determining your vote in the upcoming November election? And they divided into Republicans and Democrats. Overall, the whole population, global warming, which was one of them, ranked 24th out of 29th. Among Republicans, among moderate Republicans, it ranked 28th. Among other Republicans, 29th. Well, that tells us the gap that has to be overcome. If you look among Democrats, it was ranked fairly high, but nowhere near high enough. It should be number 1 or number 2. The other one that should be at the top wasn't even listed. There was no question, what about the threat of nuclear war? That wasn't one of the 29. So far down on the list that the experimenters didn't even think of including it. Well, those are the two issues that will determine whether human society survives or not in the near future. One of them is not even mentioned. The other is so low that it's disastrous. That tells us the work we have to do.
Professor Chomsky, in your recent speech, you cited the two major causes that see the doomsday clock set to 100 seconds to midnight, that being the threat of nuclear war and the climate crisis. You also pointed out that the 1945 bombing of Hiroshima marked the onset of potential nuclear annihilation, whilst later down the track, scientists realized that at that same period, a sharp rise in human destruction of the environment began, which is now termed the onset of the Anthropocene epoch. So how can we consider these two current existential threats having risen at the same point in time?
Well, what had happened was, to put it in broad terms, the human technical capacity to destroy had reached a point where it threatened human life. Both the climate crisis, the Anthropocene, and nuclear weapons illustrated that. However, the human moral capacity to deal with, to overcome our impulse to destroy, lagged far behind. There's a huge gap that was demonstrated. If I can give you a personal anecdote, this struck me very sharply, personally, on August 6th, 77 years ago, August 6th. I happened to be a counselor at a summer camp. In the morning, an announcement came over the loudspeaker saying that a single atomic bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. There was mild clapping, war will soon be over. Everybody went on to the next activity, swimming, arts class, whatever it might be. When I got back to the city later, I found the same thing. Exuberance, the war will be over, but let's forget about it. It wasn't just the bombing of Hiroshima, the horrible bombing. That was a demonstration that human intelligence was reaching the capacity for total destruction. Not quite yet, atom bombs weren't that powerful, but within a couple of years it was reached. And almost nobody cared. It was a shocking insight. And that's been true for the last 77 years, right until today. As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, that poll on issues that'll guide votes in the next election did not even include the very serious threat of nuclear war, which is growing. Right in the Ukraine, there's easy to see an escalatory ladder. Scientists, strategists concerned about this can't believe it. People like William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, has been involved in nuclear issues all his life. He says he's not just terrified, he's doubly terrified. Terrified by the growing threat and by the failure to pay attention to it. Well, with regard to the Anthropocene, recently at least, there's some degree of attention and concern. Nowhere near enough, and it's much too late. Should have been 40 years ago. We've wasted 40 years that should have been spent, but at least it's coming. Nuclear threat, not at all. Those are, here coming back to the gap between our capacity to destroy and our ability to deal with it, it's huge. Just before we started this discussion, I happened to be looking at current journals, current news. You can read in the national press articles saying, we ought to go all out in Ukraine, put in our whole military capacity, raise the war to a greater threat, drive the Russians out, and it'll be fine. They're not going to react. Trust me. That's the answer. Trust me, they're not going to react. So if the Russians face defeat in Ukraine, they're not going to use the weapons that, of course, they have to fend off defeat, devastate Ukraine, set the stage for nuclear war. Trust me, they're not going to do it. That's the argument. I mean, is there a word for that in the language? Lunacy doesn't come close. I don't know how to describe it, but that's that illustrates the gap. We have to overcome that gap. Whether we can do it, I don't know. If we don't do it, that's the last question that humans will ever ask, because we'll be finished.
Much of the solar industry workforce is blue collar and not high paid. What are your thoughts about the solar workers unionizing with your view of history and labor unions in other industries?
Well, I think that a substantial number of solar workers are very low paid, low wage. Many immigrants who have a weak social position, to unionize them would be very significant. We have to recognize that in the last 40 years, there has been a major war against labor. The Ronald Reagan initiated the neoliberal period by an attack on labor unions. That made sense. If you're going to carry out an assault on the population, you better eliminate the major mode of defense, which is labor movement. Corporations can make more profits by moving and by setting up low-cost, low-wage maquiladoras in Mexico, or going to China or Vietnam or Malaysia. Who cares about American workers? We're after profit. Well, that's the Clinton years. And so it continues. There is no political organization addressing the interests and concerns of working people, large mass of the population. The Biden administration actually did take steps in this direction, largely under the influence of Sanders and the popular movement he organized, but it was all shot down. Every piece of legislation that might help the country, working people, was blocked by 100% Republican opposition, a couple of right-wing Democrats. Well, there's a lot of work to do. Now, actually, there are encouraging signs. There are unionizing efforts in some of the most difficult places, like Amazon and Starbucks, where the corporations are bitterly anti-union and are willing to eager to make use of the many devices that have been developed during recent years to break and undermine unions. But some of them are succeeding. And there are others, like one of the most impressive developments in the last couple of years have been the teacher strikes, not union-led. In fact, unions were ambivalent, but in some of the most reactionary corners of the country, West Virginia, Arizona, teachers organized, non-unionized teachers organized to try to defend the educational system from the harsh attack against it. Mass public education was one of the great contributions of the United States to popular democracy back in the late 19th, early 20th century. During the last couple of decades, it's been under harsh attack. Many attempts just to eliminate it openly. Who needs public education? Supreme Court has been helping this out recently by insisting that taxpayers must fund religious education. Sharp reversal of the principles that go back to the founding fathers, the Establishment Clause. The last Secretary of Education under Trump openly wanted to just destroy the whole system, been sharply defunded. State colleges, state universities, significantly underfunded. Same with K-12. You want to destroy a system, underfunded, so it doesn't function, so that people get upset about it, try to look for something else, privatized under corporate control. Well, teachers are resisting this. Teachers are mobilizing for funding education so that a teacher doesn't have to sit in front of a class of 40 kids who haven't had breakfast and who don't have a nurse on campus and don't have arts programs and don't have sports programs because the right wing, mostly Republican legislators want to kill public education. Well, the teachers have mobilized and they've gotten a lot of public support. Arizona, where I live, a referenda on funding education passed with substantial majorities. The Republican state legislature disregards them, but the struggle goes on. It'll be a major struggle, and there's plenty of popular support. And drive around town in Tucson, where I live, you see plenty of signs supporting the teachers, Red for Ed, stores and so on. Well, that's exciting and important. There are nurses organizations have struggled to unionize and to improve the state of the scandalous state of the US medical system. All of these things are happening on the ground. And should it go on to get to the question to the solar industry? Very definitely, but it's not going to be easy. These are real hard struggles, and they're crucial. You take a look at history, you can see how crucial they are. Take what I remember from childhood, the Depression. Depression was very serious. Poverty, much greater than today, suffering greater than today, but it was a hopeful period because the union movement, which had been decimated by Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, was reviving, CIO organizing, militant labor actions was the basis for the New Deal programs, which led the way to social democracy, not only in the United States, but worldwide.
Besides the obvious right-wing media hostility to anything environmental versus the environmentally friendly liberal media, is the core issue about corporate subsidies and regulation. And what about about policies such as the US NATO sanctions on Russia that have obviously helped the fossil fuel industry by President Biden, who campaigned against that industry receiving any special treatment?
Well, the first point to mention is that it is all far too late. 40 years ago, approximately, it was perfectly clear that we're facing a climate crisis. Industry specialists knew about it. In fact, they were in the lead in exposing it. The companies reacted by launching major campaigns to direct attention away from the crisis. They recognized that it wouldn't do just to deny the crisis, because then they could be refuted. So they devised all sorts of complex means to say, yes, maybe there's a crisis, we're not denying it, but there's a lot we don't know. We haven't looked into cloud cover. There are two sides to the question. Maybe we'd be better off developing a richer economy, which down the road will be able to take care of it better. We have to debate it and so on. So just not deny, but say it's uncertain. So let's put it off. Very extensive strategies. Actually, just a couple of days ago, you might have seen a major report on BBC of the ways in which some of the corporations worked to develop strategies to undermine concern. Well, that of course incorporates the media as part of it. So yes, there's a problem, but let's not rush into things. Maybe we'll do better to just make a richer society, handle it better down the road. Now, if you look at the proposals that are being made, yes, let's put money into, let's fund ways to remove the poisons from the atmosphere. Let's do that. They don't exist, but maybe they'll exist in the future. Let's do anything except cut back on profits on fossil fuels. Now, I should say that by now, finally, last couple of years, the major media do have excellent climate reporters. Washington Post, New York Times have fine journalists who are covering the climate crisis, honestly keeping up with the latest developments. And they have a report in the paper now and then, which people can read and learn from if they want to learn more about what's happening. But it's not hitting people in the face where it has to be. It has to be front and center. It has to be made clear that we are in a unique moment of human history. Unless we deal with this expeditiously, nothing more is going to matter. We'll hit irreversible tipping points. Everybody's not going to die tomorrow, but we'll be in a point where society begins to decline into a situation so intolerable, the lucky people will those who've died. I'll just go back to what we were talking about before. What's going to happen when hundreds of millions of people in South Asia can't survive because it's too hot to live? Huge trash collections are burning from the heat. Not going to, New Delhi right now is the most polluted city in the world. From climate change, warming is making it much worse. These are hundreds, billions of people. They try to escape. They go to war to try to save themselves. What's going to happen? Well, all of that is impending. And unless the media concentrate on bringing that home clearly to people, human society is not going to survive. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for allowing us to ask you a question. And I asked the question on behalf of the 15 justices of the World Court of Human Rights, whom we expect to be gathering to begin their deliberations with the court sometime in 2025. And the question is as follows. Could you please share with us your opinion as to the most important areas of human rights law that are going to be encountered by the court? And could you please give guidance to the future court as to their deliberations and their work going forward?
Well, let's start with the narrow question of the Treaty of Lucknow over a century ago, aimed to bring together the Muslim and Hindu populations of what was then British-controlled India, British-ruled India, working for independence and creation of a humane and democratic society. A lot has happened since. I won't try to review it, but we now live in a very different situation. The partition was carried out in an extremely brutal fashion, causing enormous damage to both societies, persists in their hostility when they must cooperate if both either is to survive. South Asia altogether is facing destruction, might as well face it. It's an area which will become unlivable unless significant action is taken to overcome the horrifying impact of global warming in an area where poor people are trying to survive and temperatures sometimes reaching 50 degrees Celsius, no air conditioning, terrible conditions of miserable poverty. The idea that Pakistan and India are devoting their resources to mutual destruction when they must cooperate to deal with the problem of survival goes beyond words to describe. Within each of the societies, there are serious problems. Take India, the BJP Modi government has been working to undermine and destroy Indian secular democracy, which is one of the real achievements of the post-war period, and to try to install a Hindu ethnocracy in which Muslims are at best second-class citizens subjected to a variety of kinds of repression, taking over Muslim Kashmir, imposing a military regime of extreme brutality. Those are the problems of today for India. They're very deep and they have a lot of consequences for the world. Pakistan, there are similar questions of military rule, virtual coups to overthrow any, sometimes actual coups to overthrow any efforts to deal with the tremendous internal problems of the society. Religious domination so extreme that it's basically undermined the secular forces, even education. All of that has to be dealt with. And again, it's in a region which will simply not survive unless they overcome antagonism and work cooperatively. And what's coming down the road is pretty frightening. As the glaciers melt, you have two nuclear-armed states hostile